Welcome Internet. Today we're going to be talking about the topic of addiction to pornography, which was a subscriber's request that I found very interesting, so I was willing to discuss it. So before we dive deep into the subject, let me tell you that I am not an expert in addiction, nor in addiction to pornography. My research has led me to understand that even the idea of addiction to pornography is kind of a controversial opinion on the topic, and it's very divisive, as there's as many professionals believe that it could be considered an addiction because there is neuro processes in the brain which do seem to indicate addiction, and others feel that it's more compulsive behavior in which the person is basically being hypersexual, but it's not inherently addiction, and it's more to do with basically how society considers pornography and its usage. So there's no real baseline criteria for pornography and pornography addiction. So from what I understood is that fundamentally it has to impede social interactions, it has to impede the daily life of the individual, and it has to basically impede the mental processes, i.e. they're constantly thinking about it, they're constantly seeking pornography, and so on and so forth. So one can see that it is a very disruptive element in one's life. So there is many points of view we could take. We could take the social point of view, which basically is this idea that first and foremost, pornography has never been as widely accessible as currently, as you just need basically a cell phone, a tablet, a computer, and you have access to everything, right? So it's very easy to have it, just to get it, right? There's no longer barriers as they could have been 40 years ago, 50 years ago, where basically you had to all go to a specialized theater that showed those types of pictures, or you had to get a magazine, or you had to have a VHS, which wasn't exactly easy either because you still had to do, there was still a hidden element which still is present today, but it was not as easy, let's say, just to have it, just to access it. Now, secondly, in terms of, and this is my bread and butter, as you know, in terms of intrapsychic components, how can we analyze addiction to pornography? Well, let's talk about what it provokes. Often people who have that feel very excited. What happens is there's a form of excitement in which they will try and seek out the content that they like. And then afterwards, often what will happen is that once they've basically enjoyed themselves, they will then feel a lot of shame. Shame on many levels. First and foremost, they might feel shame upon the content that they've seen. They might feel shame because they were unable to control the urge to go and masturbate to those images. They might feel shame because of how they were brought up, if they were brought up, for example, in a religious family or household, or if the family was very taboo on sex. There might be a lot of reasons for shame, but I find it very interesting that basically there's a dynamic of excitement and shame that is happening. So how could we interpret it from a psychodynamic perspective? Well, one could interpret it very basely by saying that the urges come from the id, i.e. the unconscious mind, and what happens with the shame is that it's the superego that basically provokes the shame once it has happened, once the person has found release. However, I think that this vision would be a little too simplistic. In my perspective, it seems to be more like what happens on an unconscious level is that the person is seeking a form of gratification, a form, even I would say, of contact with humankind through the sin of pornography. So it might seem a bit counterintuitive, but the idea is basically to have a form of fantasy that is shown, a form of relation to the object without the object, i.e. fulfilling your needs that would come through contact without the object. And I think that that creates inherently a lot of guilt, because the individual might think that they are basically triumphing over the object, as if it was a form of betrayal upon the object, i.e. the relationship. Whereas the sexuality should be with another person, it becomes with an object, with themselves. There's also, I think, this form of self-punishment that the person that basically enjoys themselves feels that they, because of their own enjoyment, they feel that there is a form of guilt, a form of they have basically broken the rules by doing so. And because of the repetition, they might feel that they are losing agency and control over their lives because of the addiction to pornography, to the compulsive behavior to pornography. So I think that that loss of agency also creates a form of self-loathing, because the individual is not able to forgive themselves for for fulfilling their urges. One could also argue that the urges need to be fulfilled because it is based on complicated relationship with other people, that other people might be seen as people who cannot give or who are unwilling to give gratification or who deeply scare the individual. Therefore, there's going to be a detachment from the real individuals and a focus on pornography as a substitute with that real connection, meaning that the pornography is going to become the connection. But that connection isn't perfect, as it's only one way, and therefore it creates a form of manque, or of lack, as we would say in manque in French. Basically, there's something lacking, and I think that after the urge has been fulfilled, that's what the individual feels, is that manque, because the urge is no longer there, yet they're not connected, they're not in contact with someone, they're left with themselves. And also what I have seen clinically is that often people who engage in pornography do so in order, as a bit like in many addictions, to avoid their thought process, to avoid introspection. They engage into an external object, be it gambling, be it heroin, and so on and so forth. And it seems that sometimes in pornography there is this element of, I'm not going to think about what pains me, I'm going to just watch and see those images that will stimulate me, that at a moment will bring me joy, happiness, and perhaps a bit of relief. But then things catch up, the anxiety still catches up because it was just postponed, right? It was not cured, it was not resolved, it was just pushed away, the time of the excitement. And I think that that's at the core of drug addiction, is the phenomenon of excitement and boredom. Boredom here is something that is seen by the individual as inherently destructive, because they're left alone with their thoughts, with their mental processes, which they are uncomfortable with. Therefore, they have to find solace in the usage of pornography, of those images. So very fundamentally, the individual can't cope with the urges. And if we were to go back to Fernburn's model, that non being able to cope with the urges might be explained by the fact that the first relationship with the caregivers was not solid enough for the individual to be able to transform the urges. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that, for example, Solani gives an incredibly good example of this in his book, The Illusion of Love. That if an infant lacks love and structure in their lives, they will be much more tempted to find a quick and easy solution. For example, he gives this idea that the child basically has not experienced security enough will basically start eating chocolates in a very fast and repetitive manner in order to calm themselves, in order to be able to gain a bit of comfort, because they don't have the security and the love of the parent. Therefore, they will fill themselves with a good, happy chocolate in a way, right? And if we were to see addiction in the same way, what happens is that addiction, or to use in this case of pornography, fills that need, fills that desire, fills that will to contact, physical enjoyment, sexuality, and basically love in a way, right? In a physical contact, a form of erotic love, right? So it's fulfilling the need. but because it's not with someone else, it's not as, in a way, stable mentally. You know, in a way, it's as if, to go back to that chocolate bar, right? That chocolate is eaten, and the child enjoys it when it's eaten. But afterwards, it realizes how vain it really is, and it's not what it really seeks. So there's a way of compensation, and I think pornography and the use of pornography in a basically in a compulsive manner is a way to try and compensate certain fragileness, certain fears, and also certain desires of wanting to be loved, wanting contact, wanting sexual pleasure with another person. Because often it is often that people watch pornography and in a way they feel excited, but it's also a way of transposing themselves in the scene through the gaze, right? They're seeing themselves doing the action. But when it's all over, when the excitement has dropped, then what's left is this realization that the person is alone with their thoughts, alone with the lack of connection, alone with the isolation. And those can drive more severe parts of the mind. I was talking at the start of this video of the superego. That's basically it. The superego comes back and basically pushes down the individual, not because of the urges and the lack of control of the urges only, but because the individual feels that that loneliness is their fault. That loneliness is basically theirs, and they've not solved it. They've only postponed it. And that postponing makes the superego cruel towards them. At least all this, of course, is only a theory, and as I said earlier, I am not an expert by any means. I will say, and this is important, that this video is not meant to shame people with addictions to pornography. People have ways of dealing with sins, and that's okay as long as one tries to improve, tries to get help. I will also add, and this is very interesting and very important, people who do have these types of symptoms are often people that are isolated, that are alone, that are often sad, have depression. So it's not that addiction to pornography comes alone, it comes with a full spectrum of other issues that needs to be addressed. And it is not necessarily just the addiction that's there, it's also all of what it basically underpins. And of course I didn't talk, but this might be important to mention it, the question of trauma. As though some people use sexuality to compensate trauma, and might very well be the case for an addiction to pornography. And last point, but not the least, very interestingly enough, research has shown that if you use pornography with moderation, it's not bad for your mental health. And they've even found that some people have even, if they use pornography semi-regularly, but not as an addiction, not compulsively, it's shown as having good mental outcomes. So that's very interesting because it's not an either-or situation, right? There's a lot of nuance and there's a lot of things to be talked about. Like, for example, the gaze of the man or of the male gaze in pornography. There's so many things we could talk about on this topic, and I'm by no means saying that I've basically shown you the whole picture. The only thing I wanted to talk about was the theories of psychodynamics that we could use, not that they're right, that we could use to try and understand addiction to pornography. Anyway, I hope I was clear enough. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments. I'll send you next one.